Hey everybody, welcome back. Hope you guys all had a restful Thanksgiving break. I've got your very last asynchronous content here. So throughout this class, we've moved through the lifespan and outwards through ecological systems and levels. And it seems fitting to conclude our series of videos by talking today about the future. Where is the field going? Where should it go? What are some of the major challenges facing researchers and what can we do about them? Lots to think about. So let's jump in. We'll start by talking about a paper from our old friend Yuri Bronfenbrenner that he wrote 20 years ago, anticipating the direction the field was moving. I put it first as a way of establishing some ideas and context, and many of his points are still relevant for us today when thinking about the future of developmental psychology. We'll then get a little more specific in talking about an area of developmental research to be explored further in the future, and discuss Dr. Yip and her colleagues' paper from last year on the paradox of diversity and the importance of contact in context. Conrad and her colleagues then review a particular example of an area in need of further examination, namely how health disparities are perpetuated across generations in marginalized communities as an effect of systemic racism. Finally, I wanted to include something broad, so we're going to finish with Amir and McAuliffe's publication from just a few months ago, outlining their thoughts regarding the future of the field in the most general and generalizable terms. I should also note that all four of these studies are reviews, and this presentation will not include any statistical analysis, so not a p-value in sight. We'll wrap up with some questions to think about, and I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say when we meet on Thursday. Okay, so Bronfenbrenner. We've been talking about his theory of ecological systems all semester, so I'm going to skip going over that again. Instead, this paper speculates about the future of developmental psychology, in addition to adding a few clarifying remarks on the most recent version of his ecological model via 3 proposals. Bronfenbrenner begins with a definition of developmental science, which he uses as a kind of umbrella term for developmental psychology as well as related fields. Developmental science is an overarching discipline concerned with producing a general model for the scientific study of human development. It's a little bit like how a few weeks ago we were talking about how all psychological research can be conceptualized as developmental research. This is kind of a similar idea. Developmental science seeks to understand all human experience, but situate that within a given time frame, which Bronfenbrenner notes could be milliseconds, days, weeks, years, or even millennia, which is pretty crazy. He also notes that developmental science shouldn't be concerned with the forces that have shaped human behavior in the past, but rather those forces that will continue to shape behavior in the future. Although he does note that sometimes the past is the best way to understand the future. I thought this was a little bit confusing personally, and we'll return to this idea at the end of the presentation. Bronfenbrenner proposes updates to his ecological systems theory in the form of 3 proposals, like I mentioned. The first proposal states that development takes place over the lifespan through a process of increasingly complex reciprocal interactions between a person and other people, objects, and symbols in their immediate environment. These interactions are called proximal processes. He doesn't actually give any examples of proximal processes in this paper, but these are things like kids playing together or a child reading. And these processes can either increase or decrease an individual's ability to control or direct behavior. And as an added corollary, he notes that processes can vary in duration, frequency, intensity, and timing. His second proposition states that the form, strength, content, and direction of proximal processes vary both as a function of the person and the environment. These processes also play out in a social and historical context. So basically, he's saying that context matters, and it isn't as straightforward as saying that a given proximal process will have the same result for everyone in every situation. So after introducing Proposition 2, this paper enters into kind of a sidebar conversation about chaos, regarding the declining moral character of kids these days. I was a little surprised by that in this paper. And so the authors attribute this change to increasingly chaotic home environments and a resultant reduction in concern for the welfare of others. This discussion felt a little out of place to me, but Bronfenbrenner included it to mention that the decline of social development is the principal developmental issue facing modern children going forward. I don't know if he would still agree with that 20 years later. I don't know. Do you? And the article ends with the third proposition, which states that emotional, intellectual, social, and moral development rely upon increasingly complex interactions with other people with whom an individual shares strong mutual irrational attachment and a commitment towards that person's well-being. He does classify this as a, quote, emerging proposition, and it doesn't look like he included it in his final model. So we're not going to worry about it too much. So that was all a little abstract, but fortunately, Dr. Yip and her colleagues are going to take us back to a topic that's a little bit more relatable, in my opinion. The United States is rapidly diversifying, bringing with it many attendant advantages and challenges, hence the idea of a diversity paradox. Existing theories for explaining the impact of diversity, for instance, Bronfenbrenner or Allport's contact hypothesis, have for the most part fallen short. Allport's hypothesis, for instance, says that as diversity increases, contact increases, and if people are working towards a common goal, then contact will improve intergroup relations and reduce prejudice. But it's insufficient and, frankly, not all that helpful just to talk about diversity or contact. And so the proposed contact in context approach elaborates on these concepts in order to kind of parse the actual processes that are occurring. So, namely, who is involved in this contact, and to what specific racial or ethnic groups do they belong or identify with? When does contact occur and how frequently? Where does contact occur? And given all these factors, what explanatory mechanisms account for the results that we see? So for you visual learners out there, here is a reproduction of the model found in the publication. So remember, this model is diagramming the potential effects of racial and ethnic diversity. And those effects play out as a result of interactions between people at the interpersonal level. So that's the darker green boxes there. That's the contact part. Also, these interactions occur in the context of certain structures, such as family, school, or the workplace. So that's the context part. Contact in context. Note, too, that the people with whom you'd interact, as well as the context in which those interactions occur, changes across childhood and adolescence. The effects of these interactions also depend on the race and ethnicity of the person in question, which is represented in the model as that gray bar across the top. Okay, contact in context. So the paper itself is a review of a growing body of literature on the effects of diversity across these types of contact in different contexts, hard to say that, contact in contexts, at different ages for people of different races. And so, in thinking about that, there are a lot of different combinations you can come up with there. And rather than try to go over every combination, I've included a few sort of highlight pieces of information here that highlight one of the main points that the paper gets across, which is that increasing diversity appears to come with both benefits and challenges depending on the conditions. Some of the findings included in the paper are, for instance, babies as young as 3 months old begin to notice race and ethnicity as measured by gaze duration. However, it's not until kids are about 2.5 years old that children show any differences in sharing or borrowing toys. By the time kids are about 5 years old, they do show clear preferences for same race peers, particularly in terms of sharing and borrowing in play. Effects of diversity among very young children depend on the race of the child. It's noted that ethnicity and race might be more salient among ethnic or racial minority children. Less segregated and more diverse schools have better academic outcomes than segregated schools. It's hypothesized that greater diversity is associated with greater exposure to differing viewpoints, cultural practices, attitudes, behaviors, which in turn might yield more flexible thinking. White children with cross-race friendships are rated as more popular and socially competent. However, I thought this was interesting. Black children with at least one cross-race friend are rated as less popular and less pro-social by both cross and same-race peers. So you can see, like, you know, it's a complicated picture and it depends on a lot of different factors here. So in summary, different techniques are necessary for measuring interpersonal diversity versus structural diversity. The former uses a lot of daily diaries and momentary measures, whereas the latter tends to be based on more static mathematical indicators. Remember, that's the contact in context, interpersonal within structural. 2, as the diagram suggests, interactions change quite a lot over time. 3, there is a reciprocal relationship between exposure to diversity and subsequent engagement with what the paper calls diversity experiences. For instance, a child's preference or lack of preference for racial groups might depend in part on prior exposure. 4, in addition to the context, the actual processes of ethnic and racial development change over time. For example, adolescence is a particularly important period for the development of racial identity. Finally, the race of the child matters when looking at the impact of diversity. This is a really important point. Much of the existing literature on intergroup or interpersonal interactions lacks important nuance. The example is given in the article of a Latinx teenager attending a mostly white school versus that same hypothetical teenager attending a mostly black school. Or, for instance, an Asian American child with mostly white friends versus mostly same race friends. The current state of the field just isn't equipped to address that kind of nuance yet, you know, and the effects of those interactions. Furthermore, diversity comes in a lot of forms, not just race and ethnicity, and there's still a great deal of work to do in order to understand how these identities intersect in developmental context. Conrad and her colleagues provide a brief review of health disparities in pregnant women and infants in marginalized communities. This study is an important reminder that developmental psychology starts even before birth. Epidemiological evidence is pretty conclusive on the health disparities that pregnant women of color experience, but the mechanisms for those outcomes are still poorly understood. Chronic stress has been proposed as one such mechanism. Chronic stress can take on a lot of different forms on a lot of different levels, including, but obviously not limited to, increased exposure to trauma, intergenerational poverty as a result of slavery and segregation, racial discrimination in hiring practices, increased exposure to environmental toxins, and so on. Although these stressors are correlated, we still don't know precisely how they impact people. That is the effect additive or multiplicative? This chart here lists a number of chronic stressors that impact both the mother and the infant. For pregnant women of color, that includes both individual level factors, community level factors, and structural level factors. Babies of women with higher levels of chronic stress experience a number of negative perinatal health outcomes. And in fact, chronic stress, even before conception, is associated with lower birth weight. These complications can have persistent effects throughout the child's lifespan, creating multi-generational transmission of disparities. These are a few examples of the health disparities I was referencing, including higher rates of gestational diabetes, lower birth weight, greater likelihood of emergency room visits, altered physiological responses to stress, and accelerated cellular aging. I thought this article was a sobering reminder not only of the health disparities that exist in our society, but also of the disparities in attention that those issues have historically gotten. For instance, only 11 studies ever have examined biological changes as a result of chronic discrimination among pregnant Black women. Increasing representation among both participants in research and the people conducting it will hopefully begin to address these issues in the future. Finally, I want to wrap up by taking a step back here with this Amir and McAuliffe article. So let's zoom out a little bit. In fact, let's zoom out a lot, beyond Bronfenbrenner, beyond even the boundaries of traditional developmental psychology for a moment, and think about the future. Certainly, the future of developmental science will hopefully address important gaps in the literature, but I also wanted us to consider the tools and approaches we use as well. This paper was co-authored by an anthropologist and a developmental psychologist, so it's no surprise that they contrast these two approaches and advocate for a combination of methods drawing from their respective fields. They characterize the anthropological approach as focused on depth and primarily based on observation, whereas developmental psychology is more heavily dependent on experimental methods and a focus on breadth. If that sounds a little reductive to you, I thought so too, but they still make some good points throughout the paper, including referencing psychology's extremely problematic reliance on what they call weird samples, that is, people in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, and in particular, college students. A college student is 4,000 times more likely to be included in published psychological research than a person living outside the United States. And, white participants are heavily overrepresented in research, but so are Westerners more generally. You take a supposedly robust finding, like, for instance, the Big Five model of personality, and it turns out it doesn't hold up particularly well when you move beyond these samples. And the future of developmental science needs to broaden its horizons as well. Developmental psychology is also strengthened by collaborations with other disciplines. The example that's offered in this article is about observed differences between Eastern and Western cultures. And, there's a whole laundry list of differences between Eastern and Western cultures, but psychological investigations alone struggle to produce a theory to explain them in many cases. In fact, the best theory explaining relative collectivism and individualism within the country of China has to do with farming practices and how many people are needed to grow each crop, highlighting the advantages of collaboration with anthropologists, economists, and people from other disciplines. Amir and McAuliffe conclude the article with a short series of recommendations for practice, which I thought were insightful and useful for thinking about the future of developmental psychology more broadly. They suggest that in the future, research be drawn from questions based in evolutionarily plausible theoretical frameworks, that researchers should create standardized reproducible protocols, When possible, use formal modeling to clarify assumptions and generate predictions. And that's not modeling in a statistical sense, modeling in terms of a theory perspective. As I mentioned, seek out interdisciplinary collaborations, for instance, anthropology or economics. Engage in hypothesis-driven selection of populations. So even if that's an inconvenient sample, it should be based in a hypothesis or a theory. Where possible, examine variation at multiple levels of analysis, so within groups, between groups, even at the level of the individual. And finally, it's suggested that developmental scientists provide information about the broader ethnographic context of the society in question, which I think is a helpful recommendation for all studies. Just a couple of discussion questions here. Take a look, think on it, and I'm excited to hear everyone's reactions and responses and thoughts about the future of the field. I'll see you on Thursday.